Welcome to this session on the health in our hands, the intersection of science and digital technology to make a difference in public health outcomes. I'm joined today by an esteemed panel of friends who I'll introduce in just a moment, but we're so pleased that you all could make time to join us today. Just a note on the community that we have here. Posted before I started speaking were some community guidelines. We can't talk about products or specific actions or corporate events, so please hold your questions around that type of thing. If you have any questions about particular products, we encourage you to reach out to your physician. We invite your questions in the chat, and we will draw on these across the session. All right, so now just to set the stage for moving into this important topic, we've been in the midst of a revolution. We're 20 years into the 21st century. It's about 40 years into the digital revolution itself. We're more than 2 decades after having mapped the human genome. And now the world is emerging from a global pandemic, which has solidified some of the important advances that can be made quickly in science and the convergence with digital to make a difference for patients in need fast. We are also in the midst of exhausted healthcare budgets. And certainly inflation and crises around the world. I think that one of the things that the pandemic has taught us is the importance of health and economy and how the two of those really intersect. And that without global health, our economy really is strongly affected. And we have learned through the pandemic the importance of collaboration and partnership to make a difference for patients in need quickly, and economies continued to thrive. So certainly in the pandemic, we learned that a lot was possible, that we could lean on our understanding of genetics and our maturation of computational biology. We could leverage innovations in clinical trials. We could rely on new sources of evidence like real-world data and registries and consumer self-reporting. We could also take advantage of digital technologies and wearables and different ways of partnering across the healthcare ecosystem amongst regulators, amongst payers, amongst governments. So we've gotten to see what's possible. And our core question today really is, what will it take to further unlock these powerful trends that are at our disposal to further advance public health outcomes at a faster speed and at a greater scale? And so, as I mentioned, we have a wonderful panel with us today, and I'd like to hand it over to them for some brief introductions. And KT, you're a continuing practicing physician at Stanford and also a clinical scientist, medical director at Roche Genentech. So KT, tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Michelle. Really great to be here. Excited about the conversation ahead. I'm the franchise head for Gastroenterology and Hepatology in late stage, and those are the pivotal studies that we run to get drugs approved. And as Michelle mentioned, I still see patients. They are one of my favorite parts of this wonderful career that serendipitously I've landed in. And we want to hear from them, right? And this is about hearing from the patient directly, seamlessly, more continuously during trials, as well as also, in patient care. So that's my introduction. Let me hand it over to Effy, who is a professor in Zurich.
Thank you, Katie. My name is Effy Vayena. I'm a professor of bioethics at ETH in Zurich, or ETH, as it is perhaps more well known. And I've been working on ethics in genomics and genetics for a long time, but the last year I've concentrated my research on issues that relate to digital health and uses of data. And it is through that kind of thinking that I'm joining this panel. But my particular interest in this area is not just to look at what impressive developments we are having, which I think we do, but also to take a critical look at those and see, are these developments going to truly improve the health of all people? Or are the benefits, again, are going to concentrate on some of the people? And I think for me, that's an interesting angle to come into what's the wonderful potential of digital technology, especially in its convergence with the genomic revolution. So that's where I sit in terms of research and interest. And I will hand this over to Tomas, who I think over the years of his experience in the regulatory agents has done also some of this work that I'm very interested in.
Thanks, Effy. Great to be part of this panel, of course. And you asked us, Michelle, what.
Well, it seems that we're having difficulty with Thomas's microphone. So while he mentioned there's a heat wave in Sweden, so perhaps something's going on with the heat and his Wi-Fi. So Jan, you're a cancer survivor and a patient advocate based in Munich. Thomas, welcome back. We're just going to do Jan really quick because your Wi-Fi cut out a little bit.
Yeah.
So Jan.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. It's really, really exciting to be here because, I mean, this topic is so important to me, both personally as well as from a patient perspective, because combining science and digital has been from the start when I was diagnosed with cancer about 21 years ago, because I actually found an early phase clinical study via the internet, which was at a time when Facebook and Google didn't exist. And by the time I was actually joining a clinical study and then becoming a patient advocate. So over the years, I've been engaging as a patient advocate. I've been co-founder of a number of global patient organizations, including the CML Advocates Network and also WeCan, the work group of European Cancer Patient Advocacy Networks. And I've been engaged in the European Patients Academy, EU Party, to actually train patients about medicines R&D that they can engage in research. So from that perspective, it's always been close to my heart. And as CEO of Patvocates, I'm trying to help that patient engagement really happens in science, but also happens in digital technologies. So thank you so much for inviting me to this panel and to discuss this at a very important time where digital and genomics just meet. Thank you so much.
That's great. And now back to you, Thomas. I think your Wi-Fi is back.
Sorry, Michelle. I'm the one experiencing a thunderstorm, and let's hope it doesn't interrupt things more. Thanks for the intro, and you asked us to comment on our immediate thoughts with this title, Michelle. And there were two thoughts. The first one going exactly along your lines. We've seen during COVID what we can do when working together as a broader community and what can be achieved. And I think that we should take stock of that. Perhaps not only from what's been working well, we should also learn from the more negative things that we've seen, and perhaps I'll come back to that later on. But COVID is a specific situation, but I think there are other success stories here as well that perhaps doesn't move as quickly as the COVID one, but where we've still done fantastic work as a community, you as an industry, academia, etc. I'm thinking, for example, about oncology, but there are many other areas where fantastic progress been done during the last couple of years as well. But the second thought is exactly along what John is talking about, empowering patients and putting the health in their hands properly. And how do we do that? I'm sure we can do much better when it comes to learning about what's important for patients, informing patients not only once or through a leaflet, but on a continuous basis, feedback when it comes to outcomes. And by doing that, I think we can put the health of the patients more stronger in their control. So that's my two first thoughts, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. All right, well, let's jump right in. Effy, you're up first. Question for you. Where might we go next in terms of innovating, unlocking public health outcomes? Can we learn from the past as we move forward into the future?
Thank you, Michelle. Yes, I do hope we'll learn from the past. There is of course, there's a saying about, we talk, especially now, in relation to the pandemic, we talk about lessons learned, and the question is whether we truly learn or we just observe. So I'm hoping we're all committed to learning than to just observing and thinking, well, I wish I was learning. So I'll start us off with something that I hope maybe it's a little more controversial, but we can discuss that. So when it comes to, I agree with Thomas that we had wonderful things happening and progress both in the genomic space and also in the digital space. But my feeling has been that there has also been quite a lot of hype around many of those technological developments. So I understand that hype serves a purpose because it inspires people, it excites people, it inspires the funding. It's kind of a useful tool sometimes, but I think it does something else. It inflates expectations, and then if we don't deliver what we have promised, then there's disappointment, and eventually downstream we may have from disappointment, mistrust, and we don't want to go down that path. So what I'm hoping is that we are going to move away from the era of hype and exaggeration about all the things we can do to a more substantive phase where we start delivering more specific, the things we promise. And particularly for the digital space, I think there we do have quite a lot of work to do. One of the things we saw during COVID is that we are still having, for example, confusion about how we can use data from patients, public health data even, which we thought we've sorted out, even legally or, in terms of our frameworks. So again, I'm hoping that we're going to move away from that confusion to more clarity around how we can use data to develop our technologies, to train our technologies, and to do that in a way that it's going to be more meaningful for us. And the third, I hope direction we're going to get is that we are going to be in a better position to evaluate what works from the things we've developed. I'm feeling that we also have a gap there. So we're going from hype to more substance in what we can deliver. We're going from confusion to more clarity, or at least that's my hope, right? That's what I would like to learn and see is happening. And then from vagueness about what works to more clarity and benchmarking and clear criteria on how we can evaluate products. So, we're sure they're working as we want them to be working and serving patients and healthcare systems. So that's the direction I'm hoping we're going to be moving, or I think we should aim to move towards those directions.
Yeah, those are really important points. Like hype and health don't really go together, right?
No.
So such an important point
and
when it comes to health.
I think we've seen too much in both genomics and in digital space, but also in their convergence, we've seen quite a lot of things that don't serve us necessarily.
Yeah, really important. And Jan, you're up next. Patients have such an important perspective with regard to the genomic and digital developments. There's certainly opportunities to improve patient care. What are those opportunities and challenges that you see, and how can we make sure that we avoid stepping into the hype that Effy touched on?
Well, I think there's huge hopes, and of course there's a hype, but of course, first of all, there's great hope in the patient community, because if we just think about genomics, I mean, there's a huge promise behind that. The right treatment at the right time, understanding biology, avoiding over-treatment, under-treatment, early detection. So there's a lot, of course, we hope And if you just look at cancer, how it has transformed over the past 15, 20 years, I mean, it's very clear there's not only an evolution going on, but a revolution. What we do with it, of course, is very dependent how we develop it and how we utilize these technologies and how we are smart and how we can actually make them also affordable worldwide and not just to the richest countries. And in terms of digital, I mean, look at the promises there, information at the fingertips, devices, sensors, wearables to collect data, not only at the quarterly clinic visit, but all throughout. So you learn what it really means to live with a disease and what the treatment side effects are and what quality of life parameters are and so on, and big data to better understand signals. And then the whole issue about artificial intelligence, which of course holds the big promise that we get help to actually interpret all these masses of data and get some kind of recommendations. But I mean, there's also, let's say, a downside. And of course, we as patients are quite aware and also afraid of them because more personal might mean more alone. So patients being left behind, I mentioned that a lot of patients might not be able to afford all these technologies. What does it help if you have decision support system and remote monitoring and telehealth and so on, if the families can't afford the tablet PC to actually participate in that? Or what if the decision support systems just support the doctor to take decisions, but there's no patient interface? So the patients feel even less in control of their own health because they feel there's a big machine going on. They don't understand what's happening to them. And I think that's why we need not only to advance science and advance technology for the supplier side of the system, so for those who do research and provide services in healthcare, but also to those that are the ultimate user. And that's a bit of our concern at the moment, that we think about both sides. We think about the patient value, we think about patient access, and we think about how does patient feel and use those kind of advantages, and making sure that everybody has access to that and can use them appropriately and feels empowered with all the technologies that we have. I think that's one of the things that we're working on at the moment and trying to bring our perspective in, that they're designed the right way.
I wrote what you said down. More personal might mean more alone. Wow, that's a really important patient perspective for all of us to take forward. Thomas, you're up next. Building off of your opening comments, there's been a lot of successes and some challenges with the innovative clinical trial ecosystem. How do you see the clinical trial architecture methodology evolving in the future?
So let's start with the problem, Michelle. And the main problem to me is to better understand the true value of our drug, clinical value, not financial. We must start with the clinical value. And we're not very good at that. And we often have a talk about time and acceleration and positive benefit risk, but that's not sufficient for a product to be reimbursed and to reach a patient and being considered to be paid for. And how we need to better understand the true value of the drugs. I'm convinced that we actually develop drugs that we don't understand the full potential of today. And that's a missed opportunity. And how do we do that? That's a difficult question. But of course, endpoints is one thing that we need to reflect on. Many times we're measuring things that made sense from a more clinical treating physician's perspective. We're counting relapse rates or we're measuring EDSS, but we're perhaps not measuring tremor, pain, and things like that may matter for the individual MS patient, just an example. We need to better understand the single-arm trial data that we generate in situations where we can't do a randomized controlled trial. We're doing that in oncology to some extent, but interpretation of response rates and duration of response is not that straightforward. So how do we do this better? COVID, Michelle, gave us more incentive to do decentralized trials. I see that as an opportunity, but also a matter of fairness. Patients located far away from hospital may then be able to participate in the trial. If you're a Duchenne boy that is wheelchair bound, it's not easy to participate in the trial if you have to go into the hospital and do whatever upper limb tests, etc. And you live in a country like Sweden with big distances. So decentralized trials, I think, is relatively uncontroversial when it comes to the operational. Perhaps audit and things like that is more complicated. But I think we've learned a lot through COVID, through the decentralized. The other thing we learned about COVID is the implementation of E9, the estimand concept, handling of missing data. Suddenly, there's been an acceptance to acknowledge that there are events that are unrelated to drug and we can handle methodologically. And to me, that's been a very good, if there's been some positive things with the COVID when it comes to this, decentralized trials and handling of intercurrent events has been some. Of course, COVID had created huge problems when it comes to running clinical trials, but at least the development of the methodology has been good in that regard.
Thank you, Thomas. And Effy, you're wanting to add something on clinical trial designs, and KT wants to talk about clinical value. So let's go to KT first, and then we'll go to you, Effy.
Sure, happy to. I think what Thomas is saying really hits home for me as a clinician and a drug developer. First, as a clinician, when you see the patient in front of you, you actually know what's clinically meaningful and what's not. You can't help it. It's going to have to, it's a lightning rod that just strikes. You just know it. When they talk about, pain, when they talk about feeling unable to work, all of these things are clinically valuable, meaningful. So that face-to-face interaction is so important as a clinician. And then when you're writing the protocol as a developer and you have to meet clinical endpoints that are validated by health authorities, there are some that make sense and some that don't. But at the end of the day, there is a huge separation from that face-to-face interaction with the patient. So my wish list is somehow that whenever we develop and then validate and then, integrate the patient-reported outcome as an endpoint in trials for inflammatory bowel disease or hepatitis or COVID, et cetera, we somehow take the endpoint directly to the bedside. And that's where I think the digital technologies will hopefully bridge the gap. That's my wish list. And anyone in the audience listening to this, it's a call for innovation.
Thanks, KT. Effy, over to you on clinical trial designs. And
thank you, Michelle. And I love Thomas' point about the fact that we need to think about new designs as well, trials that give us the right answers to the questions we have, and not answers that we think they're good, but actually they're not at the end of the day very useful. But I want to link that, and decentralized trials is something that we're all thinking about with a lot of hope, again, as one sets design in particular. But I want to link that particular point with something that Jan said earlier. We should be aware of the fact that when we're talking about the digital, not everybody is online and digital. And I think we often think, well, because we are all online and we're all having all the devices, multiple devices, and we have bandwidth and we have everything and connectivity and whatever it is, I think we should just make sure we do not forget that that's not, even within wealthy countries, and there are multiple studies showing that we do not have the same access. So yes to the digital, but we should be aware of that, because this could actually bring us back to the very point we want to avoid, which is that we all have same access to the those goods of scientific development and the digital technology products. So as we are developing these new models and as we're thinking about the digital, we need to be aware of the reality of the digital and how this can actually translate into the types of data we're collecting, and therefore into the type of knowledge we're generating, and how then this applies to the groups of people that are not represented in what we're collecting, or the other way around, to what we deliver to people. So I just want to flag that point there because I think it connects Jan's and Tomas' point, and it's important for me.
Yeah, especially from your days at the World Health Organization, thinking about care for all and not excluding patients. Really, I think we could go on for another hour on this topic, but let's shift a little bit over to data sharing. And so Jan, where do we stand with data sharing at the moment? Is there enough being done to gain insights? How does this look across the regions from a patient perspective?
One of the biggest big data projects in Europe, which is called IMI Harmony. And we're in year 4. And of course, this whole big data discussion depends on the willingness of those that have the data to actually share it. And I can tell you it's tremendously difficult because people, companies, academic researchers sit on data like hands on their eggs, and it's extremely tough to get data sharing agreements agreed. And that actually is probably a bit of a testament where we are, because still we're discussing about small data sets, and because the ownership of data seems to be so precious to be able to publish, to be able to control the data, to make sure you avoid head-to-head comparison. There's a lot of reasons not to share data, and then GDPR is being used as an excuse not to share data, while in the end, GDPR is a fantastic tool to think about data protection from the start before project goes, and then it's not a barrier, it's actually an enabler because you have kind of safe environment. I mean, we always need to go back to the fact is, why did patients share their data? Why did they share their genomic, their clinical, their pro data, whatever? It is because they wanted researchers to learn. It's because they wanted to advance science. And of course, if they wanted to contribute and probably also have a benefit from that. So that's why we do all of that. That's the main intent. So in the end, the patient provides the data and has expectations. And that's why we need to drive that debate about data sharing, because it's not the one who's gathered the data who owns it. It's the patient who owns it and has given it to researchers to do their thing, both in industry and academia. And from that perspective, I think it's really important that there's at the moment a movement in Europe around that, because I mean, the European health data space and these discussions that we're having at the moment are not only discussion about data standards and about, let's say, a common rule set and harmonization across Europe. It stimulates the debate why data sharing is important, why we need to think about data governance, data sharing, data standards, cooperation models, and so on. And I mean, I greatly appreciate that this is really being put on the political agenda in Europe now to really drive the discussions around data sharing, because for us as patients, it's extremely important. And I truly believe that big data will have a lot of potential to understand signals and then validate them in proper clinical trials.
Yeah, that's great, Jan. A good perspective. I'm going to punt over to Effy in a moment, but I want to bring in our audience a bit. I'm noticing that we've got people from all over the globe: Iran, Kuwait, Tonga, Sweden, Canada, Argentina. Each of these countries has their own unique situation, but all of them have patients and healthcare provider and data to improve outcomes for patients. So tell us a little bit about the international landscape of data sharing, and how are we making progress here internationally? Effy?
Thanks, Michelle. So I think all in all, we are making some progress. If I had my slide deck, I will show you a screenshot from a paper that was published in Nature a year ago, exactly a year ago from today, June 2021. And the big title was Wanted: Data Guidelines for Data that Sharing That We Can All Trust. And that's during the pandemic, where we did share a lot of data and, you know, we did make a lot of progress, but still we were not able to share the way we would have wanted to share data, even in that moment of crisis. And I think that title, Wanted, is quite actually quite, you know, interesting to reflect upon. So we are having still the problems that I think Jan mentioned very clearly. And those who sit on the data tend not to want to share the data. And my important distinction for me here is that these are not the patients. The patients tend to want to share the data, but then it's not individual patients that could share data, it's institutions that hold the data in various forms and shapes. So there, I think we have one major issue, and we still have, I believe, the wrong incentives for those in charge of data to actually be able to share them. And there, I have to admit that we haven't had the progress that we should have had. Incentives are still, I will belong to a different kind of era. What we are seeing, which is really interesting, is consortia. So the global consortia within either disease-specific areas or, you know, other cooperations, where somehow they figure out the data sharing, you know, in a kind of, you know, wonderful way. That's promising because it shows us that's doable when there is political will, and I'm using political not in politics, but in, you know, our will to make these things work. So their work, and they work within our regulatory schemes that I know a lot of people complain about. Yes, we can make these regulatory schemes a little nicer and more, you know, appealing, but I still think that it's possible within what we have. And I liked Jan's point about the fact that GDPR is not an obstacle, but it is an obstacle that it's something that's forward as a problem for data sharing. I think GDPR has an image problem, as I tend to say. We think that it is something wrong, but it actually, if it's used appropriately, it does facilitate our sharing. So I feel that we haven't done the kind of progress that we should have made at the global level. I think COVID showed us that it is possible, but we still have a lot of work to do. And I have to say that for Europe, I do hope that with the new movements, the European data space and others that we'll talk about, hopefully within those schemes, we'll see that the kind of guidance or the frameworks that we can copy and paste and repeat everywhere, at least in this zone, in geographical zone, that will facilitate sharing.
Yeah, thanks. And for those of you online, I welcome you to send in your questions for the panelists via the chat. It looks like we've got great engagement around the globe. For those that are new to data sharing, KT, you know, this is kind of a newer newer phrase, if you will, and I would just encourage for those of you for whom this is kind of a newer term to step into this world. A little bit of knowledge goes a long way, because certainly to help patients and overall public health outcomes, this is an area where we all need to collaborate much more. But certainly, I'm curious, KT, from your perspective, if the pandemic brought any learnings with regard to security issues or public health, what helped and what got in the way in terms of data sharing?
Yeah, this is a tough question, and it's a complicated one. So thanks for lobbing it over my way. But first and foremost, I just want to applaud all of the patient advocacy groups, the various academic communities and registries, the sponsors and the health authorities for coming together during the pandemic to really accelerate during a time when we've never really in this modern era faced such a crisis from a health perspective. And I would say we delivered. But I think what we learned with regards to data sharing is that there has to be prioritization and security. And what I mean by that is there's going to, as soon as you have data, there will be a queue out the door, so to speak. And there is no prioritization on what will be most impactful, because we can't take all of the queues all of the time. We can take some, and focus on the most important ones. So I would say in a time of emergency where we know translational research speed is still really slow, we know drug development speed is really slow, I think the prioritization scheme has to look at, will the research question and the data sharing agreement accelerate development? And will it accelerate translational research with the highest impact factor? Mm-hmm. And that's what I think is the next dilemma.
But Katie and Effy, sorry if I'm the older, gray-haired, grumpy man here, but I have to admit that I've got mixed feelings about this. And the positive side is that I totally agree with you that to progress things, we need to put data together and learn from the collective information we have. And there's some very promising, good initiatives, and IMI was mentioned, CPATH. There are other alternate initiatives that are really helpful. And to establish a new endpoint, for example, I'm sure that this is the way forward. For an individual sponsor to validate whatever we mean by that, a new endpoint, it's hopeless because you've not validated it until you have your approval, and then what was the point? So that's on one hand. On the other hand, I think COVID also told us that we have to be very careful with poor data or not understanding the data and learning the wrong things, and how quickly science is thrown out of the window because a politician thinks that something is working because he saw that in a database, and we saw database studies that didn't work. And we have to be respectful that there are some policy people that talk about this only as being excess and putting things together. And once we have everything together, we can draw all sorts of conclusions. I think that's naive. I think we need to consider much more how to draw conclusions from these data sources in a robust way, because the decision makers, at least the one I know within the regulatory organizations, etc., if you talk about big data, real world data, this is not going to buy you, and this is not getting you any points. That just sounds scary. You have to be much more detailed. You have to really tell them you need to have the methodology, how you're going to evaluate the data in a robust way. Then you can have a conversation. And I think that there still is a need to develop methodologies around how we utilize these data sources in a way not to work as a hypothesis generating, not as perhaps provide individual patients to information how a population behaves, but to generate information about the drugs we're developing. That still is a big uncertainty to me. So sorry for being a bit
I think I would just 110% agree with you, Thomas, because we know what research can do when you don't have a true hypothesis nor a methodology that's robust. And it's more damaging. Misinformation can be more damaging, as we all know on this call, than the real science that gets publication in Nature, but doesn't go out to the masses, the patients. They don't read Nature, by the way.
Right, still.
Yeah, and Effy, I think what Thomas just said linked back to your comment on hype. That we need to really take care that the science remains robust, right? And certainly that's critical. Is there anything that you wanted to build off of what KT or Thomas said?
I agree with Thomas, and I think one of my earlier remarks was also that we are in need of frameworks that allow us to evaluate our technologies. And what I was referring to is also those methodologies, right? And it does link to the hype and excitement, because we think if we have all this data, something magic is going to happen. And I don't think, and science is not magic. We need the robust methodology, and we need the way, the criteria with the methodology and the design and the criteria against which we're evaluating something. My only, perhaps, and I don't think it's a difference with Thomas, is that these things are not mutually exclusive. We still need to be working towards facilitating data. That's one of the issues we need to work on, and in parallel, at the same time, we need to work on clarifying our designs and the models we're using, but also the criteria against which we evaluate what we're producing, so we have clarity and robust science.
Yeah, that's really important. We have a question from Roslyn from London, and she's asking, what sort of work is being done to include health and social care workers in gaining the necessary skills like artificial intelligence at work? I'll open this up to the panel to see if anyone wants to jump on that. I know in Europe we have the ongoing IHI work building off of IMI, but I would say that you've pointed out an important aspect of the need that everyone in the healthcare ecosystem really needs to gain an understanding of the importance of data. I myself am not aware of any work ongoing to help health and social care workers gain data skills. But perhaps after a few minutes here, someone on the panel has had KT.
I can't think of anything for social care workers, but I think AI can be leveraged to optimize patient identification for clinical trials when we have a hard time enrolling in a certain study. And that's kind of at the intersection of what a social care worker might hear that the clinician may not. For example, a study on long COVID or a study on mental health. Those are some of the things that end up kind of getting triaged because I think physicians are kind of overwhelmed with something that they can really identify organically, like you have a pneumonia or you have inflammatory bowel disease exacerbation. And if you have depression, anxiety, that does get kind of linked to more of our social care workers. So can we leverage AI to really optimize patient participation in studies in that way?
Mm-hmm. It makes me think of the importance of the electronic healthcare record. And so even if healthcare workers aren't being trained per se in data, the electronic healthcare record is setting a foundation to help that data flow. Several questions again from the audience, one from Mariam in the Netherlands, any view on data donations? And then another one from Switzerland, gathering more data is clearly helpful in the context of deep learning. If the data is scarce, how do we collect better quality data, and any guidance on gathering good quality data and its preparations? So data donations, is anyone familiar with this area?
Maybe Michelle, it's interesting that the European health data space, the new movement in Europe around that is thinking along some sort of those lines by also introducing the idea of altruism, which is donating out of altruistic purposes, and also introducing something that they call altruistic consent. So there is some codification, let's say, of the concept that you can donate data, but this again it's something about the individual. So it is the patient who is donating or who is the altruist. And so we're waiting to see how they're going to spell this out, what it really means. And then we can see also whether that concept of donation is something that it stretches over, not, from the individual to the organizations that are in charge of those data. But that sort of, from a distance kind of view. I don't know if Jan has more on that.
Well, I can probably respond in general about data donation. And I think patients, you mentioned the altruistic reasons and also individual reasons why patients should do that. And I think the readiness of patients to donate their data to really contribute to research is very high, as long as you explain well why they should be doing that. So there's been a survey of more than 2,000 rare disease patients, which was published by Roche, a rare barometer survey, how they called it, where it was very clear that 9 out of 10 rare disease patients support data sharing. And actually, they're also in agreement of sharing it outside of their own disease field if it helps to foster research. But they're, of course, very concerned about misuse. So the framework around that, to use data, for example, for insurance company that would then take them off of insurance cover because they are then risk people. This is what patients fear. And I was talking years ago to somebody leading the biobank in Heidelberg, and I was asking, he was presenting at a conference saying they have a consent rate of 98.3% of sharing biosamples with their biobank. Bit of different topic than data, but the motivations are the same. And I said, how did you do that? And he said, well, because we brought the informed consent document to 2 pages and formulated it in a way that patients can understand what's happening with their sample. And I think that pretty much explains the whole thing. So when we do all that kind of donation data, digital apps, whatever, we need to think about what's the patient value of feeding a machine. Because in the end, of course, they're altruistic in a way, but in the end, individual patients like me, when I got cancer, we want to, of course, we're first and foremost interested in what I'm getting out of that. And if I get the impression I have an app that actually where I capture my any kind of biodata or whatever, but I can take that to my doctor and have a better conversation with him or her, then it helps me. But if I just need to enter that kind of questionnaire every morning, it goes somewhere, I never see it again. It doesn't improve my communication with the doctor. It doesn't improve my therapy. It doesn't help to detect early warning signs or whatever. Why should I spend my lifetime as a cancer patient in feeding a machine? And I think that's very important when we talk about the concept of volunteering or donation of data. Let's think about what's the value of those contributing the data directly as individuals and what's the value for the system. And if both are positive, then it's going to work. And we need, of course, to build a technical and legislative environment, which we're on the way with data space and so on, to really make that happen, that researchers can do something with the data then. So that's just my plea in terms of volunteering, donating data. Let's think about patient value.
Yeah, that's great, Jan. Now I'm thinking about moving on in our agenda to talking about the shifts that are needed in the regulatory and operating environments of healthcare to improve outcomes. I probably each of you have something that you'd like to highlight in terms of a shift. So maybe if we could go one by one. Thomas, do you want to kick us off? I know that you're passionate about several shifts that are.
Yes, no, it's dangerous to start with me because I'm not sure there will be any time left for the other ones, Michelle. But I'll try to be brief. So building on the previous one, and just recognizing that we're in the nice situation that we're currently developing, or you currently developing drugs that targets disease progression, may offer cure. It then comes with, it's not a price, but a consequence that we often need to study the drug very long to fully understand its potential. And that's true regardless if we're talking about Duchenne or Alzheimer or whatever we're talking about. And I think we need to keep that in mind when we, on the previous conversation, when we talk about data sources. There are lots of good data sources in terms of registries out there already, but they may not capture exactly what we're interested in. And here, sponsors, regulators, HTA payers, the community, we need to initiate conversations very early, because if we want to utilize these existing registries to capture data, we need to go in early to do that. Even if they have good quality, they may not capture what we're interested in, and we need them to change that. So an early conversation around the long-term data generation is important, not only focusing on initial approval. And for any Alzheimer product, we're never going to understand the value when we approve it. And currently, I'm not aware of any good registry where we can learn about the progression in patients that have not yet, that have mild cognitive impairment. Now, when it comes to progressing things, I think it comes down to competence, capacity, and knowledge a lot. And that sounds woolly and unclear, but COVID has in a brutal way displayed the vulnerability, if that's the correct expression, of the EU regulatory system. Perhaps together with Brexit, but we've shown, it's not my words, that it has shown the capacity limitations, and with that comes competence. And if we want to progress this, it needs knowledgeable people on all sides of the table to be able to discuss, understand, and sometimes make this leap of faith that, yes, we trust in this endpoint because it is, we believe it's a reasonable one to go with. And if you don't have the capacity and the competence, it's so easy that you just go back to being conservative and say, well, let's count relapses because we've always done that, and I'm sure that's a good way forward. So COVID has illustrated the need to work together, but it's also illustrated the need to build capacity and competence within all stakeholders. It doesn't help if it only resides within academia or industry. It needs to be on all sides of the table.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Thomas. Maybe before we go into the lightning round with what are you most excited about question, do one or two of you want to build off of what Thomas said and highlight shifts that need to be made?
Well, I can probably come in because I think the topic of capacity and competency has been so core to our patient movement over the past years. Because years ago, when I started in advocacy, it was really hard for us to contribute to scientific discussions or regulatory panels and so on. And with initiatives like EUPADI and others, we have tried to empower the community not to be better scientists, but actually to work as equal partners, because patients bring their unique competency in and understand science enough that they can actually discuss about patient preferences, robustness of data, clinical outcomes and patient-reported outcomes, and suggest pathways that address patient preferences. But we need to follow that pathway, because if we all hold the promise of involving patients in everything, from trial design over review, over assessment, we need to have many more people like me and many others that have done the EUPADI course and so on. So we must invest into competency and capacity, not only in those that are, let's say, healthcare professionals and researchers and regulatory people. We need to invest into the capacity and competency of the patient community to be able to contribute to all these committees and all these gremiums and all these research groups and so on. And I think we're by far not yet there, but we're all working on it. But competency and capacity is so important to us.
Yeah, really important. KT.
Just very briefly, I will say that I'm excited about sort of the, from the regulatory landscape, innovative trial designs. Can we use, Bayesian methods, or, using large data to really think about pivotal studies and integrated studies? And Thomas mentioned decentralized trials. I will say that decentralized trials are exciting to us, but it's also quite difficult. And I really hope to see this in the near future.
Mm-hmm. And Effy, what excites you the most about the health in our hands and the convergence of science and digital?
I think this amazing opportunity that we have to increase access to good quality of healthcare. What I started off with is what I want to end with. We do have in this convergence the opportunity to be more equitable in access to care, because we can with these tools, and we have so strong signals. And I hope we're not missing this opportunity to do it now, because we know what history we have, and COVID, if it showed one profound thing, it was that we are not all standing equal against the disease or healthcare or catastrophe. And so hopefully what we are experiencing now and all these possibilities is something we'll be able to share more equitably.
Mm-hmm. And Jan, what excites you?
Well, I'm excited about equity as well. And equity has also to do with robust evidence about what patients really want and need, what their preferences are, what the unmet patient needs are, and how they match what we do in clinical science and also in basic science. So how does the patient priority, the risk benefit expectations, patient preferences, real world data inform us what we should be researching on, what patients really want, and how we actually also make that accessible to everyone later on, and not just in centers of excellence, but across the field for any patient in need. And I think digital technology will help us a lot on that, because we can actually solicit what patients really want. We can observe whether it's being used the way we expected it, and whether in real world it performs the same way as we predicted in a very controlled environment in clinical trials. And that's what really excites me at the moment, that we have the technology, and on both sides, the medical side and, let's say, on the internet, the devices and so on, to really capture what patients want and how patients are using that, and play that into the research field. That's really exciting.
Great. And Thomas, 30 seconds. What excites you?
It is the very new, the products that are coming along now through your pipelines in the industry, the promise that they have. And I just hope that they met with the understanding that sometime, for many of these, it takes a very long time to understand the true value. And you can't expect it to be there fully at the time of first approval. And all stakeholders need to understand that our system is more suitable for an hypertensive drug that immediately reduces blood pressure than something that has an influence on disease progression of a childhood disease.
Mm-hmm.
And now I'm not talking about the regulatory system. I'm thinking more about the financial system.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all. I think that, when we look back 100 years ago, public health and health outcomes were vastly different and much worse than they are today. So I do think that what excites me is this continued evolution of the improvement overall of the world's health and the citizens of the world. So much to do, but this convergence of medical advances and digital technology certainly has a lot of challenges, but also holds a lot of promise. And I do want to harken back to something that Jan said, that as our technology gets more personal, we need to make sure that people aren't excluded or left alone. And certainly this world of data is something that all of us, patients, healthcare providers, are going to have to step into to get more educated, so that we can improve the health outcomes for the world's populations. So I want to thank the audience for joining us for this engaging 1-hour conversation. I want to thank our esteemed panelists for joining us along the way and giving us nuggets of insights and challenges to step into to help evolve our ecosystem. Our next LinkedIn Live event will be in the fall, and we'll be talking about diversity in clinical trials. We look forward to seeing you at our next LinkedIn Live. Thank you all, everyone.